Welcome to Richard and Greg, a channel dedicated to discussion, debate and argument on a whole array of topics. Today, Greg and Richard discuss the latest coronavirus figures, but in particular relation to comments and questions raised by one of our channel's subscribers, Paul the Merciful, where we attempt to address each of the points that Paul has made on a recent video. So let's take a listen. Welcome to Richard and Greg. The date is Sunday, I had to think then, the 5th of April 2020, and it's 11 o'clock GMT +1. Yesterday evening, we published a video on our Richard and Greg channel, Coronavirus Update, Peak Infection Predictions. How accurate are they? And we've had quite a good response, certainly in terms of in-depth comments, by a number of our subscribers, for which we're extremely grateful and are making every attempt to answer each one. But Paul the Merciful actually came up with a number of comments and then indirectly questions. And we thought it appropriate to do a quick video on this, whereby I will ask Greg his opinion on what Paul the Merciful has said. We think it's important that not only do we answer your questions, but when a number are raised, and they can be interpreted also sometimes differently by different people, that we try and give clarification as to where we are coming from. So let's say good morning to Greg, and then I'll read what Paul has said. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning. I saw the list of questions, but I just skipped and read 3 of them and thought these are all perfectly valid questions. I'm used to Paul the Merciful's comments on this channel, and I haven't read the others, so every one that Richard now asks me will be coming at me completely without preparation. So I hope that we can give valid answers that keep everybody informed.
Okay. Well, Greg, that's probably your excuse for not giving good answers then. So here it goes.
Indeed it is.
Okay, this is how Paul kicks off. The statistics used by the BBC every day are obviously false. Number of new infections, the government has no idea. Death certificates, America has admitted seasonal flu and coronavirus deaths in records are mixed and inaccurate. Now, do you wish to make a comment vis-a-vis that, any of that?
Well, that was 2 questions in one. So let's start with the best one. The first one, sorry. Statistics used by the BBC. Yes, we have stated again and again and again in our podcasts that the statistics are fundamentally bunkum. And it's a case of garbage in, garbage out. So they're actually telling you very little. The number of new infections, the government has no idea because it's told people who think they have COVID-19 to stay at home unless it becomes medically serious and they need hospital treatment. So they haven't been checked. They haven't been recorded. There is no idea how many people have got this disease. As for death certificates in America, America's system is as inaccurate as ours. Off the top of my head, out of their 350 odd million people, they have actually tested somewhere in the region of 1.3 million. This test, nobody knows what the test was actually for. Was it a test that they're not very well? Or was it a test that they had coronavirus? Or was it a test that they had a flu of some sort? Or what was it a test for? So their figures are inaccurate. I think the same goes for every country around the world.
He then adds, Greg, only research next year or in the next years will tell us where and why that death certificate's records broke down. I think you mean, and why the death certificate records broke down. Which is, yes, he's right. We'll only know in the future what exactly happened. So he then goes on to say, I have criticism of the government not ordering tests early, and I have criticism of government not having enough PPE, which is personal protective equipment, for staff. Your comments on that?
Firstly, the death certificates record, it will be a matter of academic study after the event. Academic study does very little to save lives at the time. It may well save lives in any future pandemic, assuming enough of us survive to be remotely concerned about future pandemics. This one could be the be all and end all. Nobody actually knows. We don't even know if, having had it, you will be inured against catching it again.
Mhm.
We don't have any idea of any immunity that you may have gained and for how long that immunity may survive. We have no idea to what extent coronavirus, at what speed it is mutating. This is a new mutation. It's called COVID-19. Whether that's because it started in 2019 or because they've had 19 in the last 3 weeks. Nobody is actually letting on. Half the world governments are calling it coronavirus, the other half are calling it COVID-19, and 100% of the governments have no idea how many people have got it. As for criticism of the government not ordering tests early, what will these tests actually tell us? We know that they have tests, not enough for everyone to be tested willy-nilly at random, which is understandable, but not enough to test all of the care workers, for instance. Yet there is no known test that you can give somebody as to whether they have coronavirus. You can only take a blood sample and then process that blood sample to see if it has live virus in the blood sample. That is a long-winded process of culturing. That is absolutely useless as to test. It's a little bit like saying, this car has superb brakes, but they only cut in 2 minutes after you finish putting your foot on the pedal. So I'm not as impressed by tests as others. I get the impression that tests are actually a way of buying off political opponents or crucifying political opponents if you haven't got enough of them, or a means to pacify a slightly panicked public. I don't have the same level of criticism of the government. I think they are working to the best of their ability. It's all very well for opposition politicians to say, but we had a policy. No, they didn't. They had an outline. One of the past Minister of Health, Alan Johnson, who was Labour, came on British television this morning talking to Sophie Ridge, and he said, we used to have exercises in coping with this. No, they didn't. They used to have exercises in coping with a terrorist incident. They used to have exercises of a very limited nature, coping with serious accident or serious epidemic, but it involved next best to nobody when you're talking of dealing with 67 million people, and it was all a bit fake. So that test was not telling them anything, because if this had been a pandemic that wasn't respiratory, let us say one like cholera, with everybody having chronic diarrhea, you would have needed completely different equipment, completely different personal protection equipment. Sorry, the government cannot prepare for every eventuality. And even if it did, it would have to do it over periods of time, which would mean that any given pandemic, virus, whatever, the equipment would be out of date relative to what could be available. And it's a recipe for bankrupting the country before you even start.
Now, that's a fair comment. With regards to tests, I'm sure the test that they are carrying out does give some indication, although obviously, as you rightly say, unless it's a proper blood test, it's not going to be foolproof, but it must give them some indication of some ailment or other. With regards to personal protective equipment for staff, your point is taken, because a lot depends on what the virus or disease or contagion happens to be, will dictate what sort of protection individuals need. But I think certainly things like face masks, not so much protecting you against catching it, but to some degree helping stop you giving it to someone. Perhaps they could have been greater supply. Maybe, I don't know if Paul is referring to this, but certainly in America, the president did have the ability some 2 weeks ago to sign an edict that basically instructed companies to produce these sorts of equipment, and he delayed. So I don't know whether Paul's referring to that specifically, but do you not think, certainly in America, that perhaps they could have acted sooner?
Well, talking of acting sooner, I had a really exciting day the day before yesterday. My house is rural and we have a septic tank, which didn't seem to be functioning correctly. Now, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lids between the house and the septic tank at the bottom of the garden. And it wasn't flowing as quickly as I would like, and I thought a problem was building up. So we took each lid off, had a look, put the hose in, climbed around with it. Yeah, no problem. I was absolutely prepared for doing this. I was wearing an old pair of jeans. I was wearing a sweatshirt so that my body was covered. And I had a pair of rubber gloves, heavy duty, that came up to my elbows. Absolutely perfect for the job. Until I got to the last manhole cover, took the lid off, and there were roots growing in through the side. So I thought, right, we'll oink them out and that'll solve the problem. I prodded around and that which had backed up all went through, but I still had to get the roots out. So I stopped heaving at these roots. I have all the right gear on for doing the job until one of the roots broke unexpectedly and the complete root system ended up straight in my face. So this is just a microcosm of the sort of problem that our government is facing with dealing with a problem like this. Okay, it's not a septic tank, but had it been cholera, it could have been much the same. Hospitals with entirely blocked toilet systems due to excessive use.
Okay. Well, he then adds, but I agree with Greg, now is not the time to press that in Parliament, which is fair enough. That stands on its own. Now, this is potentially more contentious. Singapore cafes and restaurants are open. No house arrest policy. Sweden does not have people locked in at home today. They are out in the healthy spring sunshine getting vitamin D. Japan does not have its entire population under house arrest. South Korea does not have people locked in at home. Heathrow is still open. Flights arriving every 10 minutes from around the world. They get home via the tube and cough over key workers, then get in a taxi. This is the daftest quarantine in the world.
I think, let's run through them quickly. Singapore cafes and restaurants are open. Lee Kuan Yew and his father have proved eminently good at ruling the country, and they are working a form of shutdown in that they are doing a certain amount of social distancing, I understand. They are taking necessary precautions, and I gather a percentage of the population are wearing masks. They also have a very small population. We're trying to control it in a country with 67 million, America 350 million. Sweden hardly has a population, leave alone anything else. It's very sparsely populated. Very few people would be in any close proximity in any form of crowd, and therefore lockdown might not be necessary, though I think they will find that eventually, if they wish to slow it down, they will need some form of lockdown, just as Japan will, because the aim of our lockdown in Britain is not to stop the disease, it's to flatten the peak. In other words, have 60 to 80% of the population of Britain catch the disease over a prolonged period so that it doesn't overwhelm the health service, so that everyone who requires serious medical attention will have access to that serious medical attention, because we've slowed down the speed at which it happens. And therefore, the peak is not as high, though it will be considerably prolonged, but we will save more lives that way. South Korea is a strange case because it would appear, looking at the details, that South Korea really only got one serious outbreak of this as a result of one idiotic church going against the government policy. And in fact, I gather the leaders of that church are likely to be charged with manslaughter because they called a meeting when everyone in the country had agreed that there would be no public meetings. Heathrow being open, yes, it is open. Most of the flights are ongoing, i.e. the people land here and go somewhere else. However, many of the flights are cargo, huge numbers of them. Also, they're taking the diverted traffic from Gatwick because Gatwick is closed, and they are also the main airport to which British citizens, and were over 1 million of them, spread around the world on vacation or non-essential jobs, who had to be brought back to Britain, because that is the way we operate it. We try not to abandon our people overseas. So that is understandable. The checks do seem to have been fairly limited. A friend of mine got back from New Zealand the other day, having come via Australia, where they had to spend 2 days in the transit lounge because Australia wouldn't let them in landside. So they had to stay airside to await their on flight, and they flew in a single haul from Australia to Britain, came into Heathrow and came straight through customs. But it is reasonable to say that in a 20-hour flight, or 20 hours of observed flying time, including booking in, it would have become apparent if they were unwell.
Okay, then he adds, reason for house arrest to help the NHS. So after 14 days, the new cases should be 0. Let's see if it's been a waste of time with a cost of £800 billion plus, or a great success. 0 cases, then we get reinfected, with travellers arriving at Heathrow and back to square one. Your comment on that?
Paul, there's zero logic in what you said here, in my opinion. Yes, you've made a fairly valid point, but to help the NHS, it's not to clamp down for 14 days and then there will be no cases. It is to try to stop the cases being presented at hospital doubling every 3 days, because on that basis, we will find that the health service, even with the new Nightingale wards, will be overrun. What we are trying to do is reduce the speed at which it travels. And if we can get that down initially to doubling every 4 days, doubling every 5, doubling every 6, there will come a level at which the health service can deal with every single case that is presented to them and provide ventilators, oxygen, and hands-on intensive care for every case that requires it, many of whom we know will die. But the more attention people can get at that end of treatment, i.e. the serious end, the more will survive. And the aim is to save lives by flattening the peak and prolonging it. There's no doubt about that. See if it's been a waste of 800 billion? No, it won't have been a waste under any circumstances, because our government are doing the best they can. They are the government we elected by an overwhelming majority. They are the government that we entrusted this job to. Can you imagine, had it been entrusted to Jeremy Corbyn, he'd had the IRA running it in 10 minutes flat.
Okay, so in a nutshell, what you're saying, Greg, is the majority of people are going to get this. All the government's trying to do is to stop it peaking at numbers that the health service cannot deal with at the time. Okay.
Correct.
Okay, so he then says, Richard summed up the state of information we're given in a nutshell. exaggerated data for a desired political outcome, suppression of truth to prevent panic, and the honesty issue. If governments were honest, they would have to say, we don't know. He then adds, the seasonal flu deaths in America are at or around 23,000. Bad flu has a way to go to get to 500,000 deaths from seasonal flu worldwide. It will be because COVID-19 just tips the cause of death over the balance. In many cases, it's not dangerous on its own. In 80% of cases, it's so mild, you wouldn't even know you had a killer flu. Because it isn't, you need to be weak first. Ask Prince Charles. He survived it without difficulty at an advanced age. Your comments on that to sum up?
Oh, I take umbrage with at an advanced age. Prince Charles is younger than I am. Seasonal flu deaths in America are around 23,000. Yeah, they are. Mostly amongst the seriously elderly, those who this becomes the cause of death that was going to happen anyway within a short period. That is the normal situation with flu. Yes, a few people who have chronic asthma or serious heart disease may well die amongst that number, although they're not at natural end of life. Richard was quite right when he said that governments may exaggerate data for a desired political outcome. Well, they're not exaggerating the data on this lot. It looks as if they are wildly underestimating it because they don't know how many people have got it. They just don't have the data. We're back to GIGO again, garbage in, garbage out. Suppression of truth to prevent panic. Yeah, there is merit in that. Otherwise, you will have people saying that there's going to be no toilet rolls and people will buy themselves huge stocks of toilet rolls and other people won't be able to get any. So you try to run a measured system. Okay, toilet rolls was a silly example, but it gives an indication since the same problem has happened in various countries. Now, if the public panic, you will have them dashing around in all directions, doing things that make solutions harder to come by. The honesty issue, if governments were honest, they would have to say, we don't know. Well, they have effectively said, we don't know, but they don't keep broadcasting they don't know because they don't want to frighten people, because there's little point in frightening people unless you have an answer to the problem. Bat flu. Well, firstly, we don't know this is bat flu. We know that it is because, if for no other reason, we know that it isn't a flu. It is coronavirus, a mutation of it. Flu is a completely different viral disease. And to call this flu in order to downplay it is taking an obscenely massive risk with the health of humanity in general. COVID-19 tips the cause of death over the balance. Yeah, well, that's what viruses do. They tip the cause of death over the balance until you're dead. In many cases, it's not dangerous on its own. Well, it does look as if there are various mutations and strains of this particular COVID-19, in that some people get it very mildly and others it is life-threatening and many leads to death. This is not based purely on age or health. 2 perfectly fit nurses have just died, and they were both quite young, in their under 40, with no other health issues. I'm sure there have been others, nurses, who've died that we don't even know about. Half a dozen doctors have died. Now, what conclusion do you intend to draw from the fact that more of the doctors have been Muslim than have been of other religions? I don't think it has anything to do with their religion, but statistically, more of the doctors who have died have been Muslims. Yet they are very much a minority, a fairly sizable minority, but a minority across the health service. 80% of cases are so mild, you wouldn't even know you had killer flu. Well, let's get away from this gimmick of calling it flu. It's not flu. It doesn't even have the same effect on the lungs as flu. It doesn't even work in the same way as flu. We know how flu functions as a virus. We don't know how COVID-19 functions. We just don't know. There has not been enough research. It hasn't been around. It was in a laboratory being worked on. It's obviously very difficult to find volunteers to catch it, so you can cut them up and see what it caused. So it was laborious work being done in various laboratories around the world. We know that it was being done in Wuhan. We also know that it was being done in Canada, and no doubt it was being tested and experimented on to see if we could come up with some form of vaccine in various other countries. When it comes to our Prince Charles, he survived it without difficulty at an advanced age. He has superlative medical attention. Did he actually have it? Was he tested to see if he was unwell? Or I test, if I feel unwell, I take my temperature. That's a test, you know. What test do you mean? And what test is the government actually talking about? Yes, a lot of people have had high temperatures, a dry sore throat, and one of the giveaways as to whether it was COVID-19 after the event, and one could be facetious and say autopsy the body, but people who have recovered seem to have lost their sense of smell and their sense of taste. One friend of mine who believes they've had the virus, and I think they're probably right, she's young, she's about 30, she's got 2 children, hardly surprising that she's picked it up, and it was a dry cough, feeling absolutely rotten, very high temperatures, repaired to her bed for 4 days, and at the end of it, having not eaten, but just forcing herself to drink all the way through that period, she found she had no sense of smell and no sense of taste. And the only thing she wanted to eat was curry because she might be able to taste it. Everything else tasted like wet cardboard. So situations are different for everybody. That rounds up the questions that Paul asked. I hope this answers them for everybody, and I hope that we'll be able to do this format again if there is somebody with a long string of questions, because answering such a long string on the computer and then on the keyboard, A, takes considerable time, B, we don't have that time available, and C, not enough of the people will actually read the individual answers to individual questions. However, putting it into a podcast may overcome all those problems. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Greg. Really appreciate it. I can add that Chris Cuomo, who is a TV personality presenter in America, 49 years of age, absolute health freak. He allegedly has coronavirus. He's now stuck in his basement. He's the brother of the governor of New York, who is undergoing severe problems there because they have inadequate number of ventilators and they're expecting a peak either this week or next week. And it's quite ironic, actually, because Governor Cuomo is out on the front line with health workers and he doesn't get it. And Chris Cuomo is sat behind a desk on television and he catches it. And he's now confined to his basement, and every day he's producing a podcast more or less stating what he's going through. And it certainly does sound horrendous, especially at night. The fever is so powerful that he is having hallucinations about meeting his dead father and having discussions with him. So clearly he's not showing necessarily flu symptoms, as you rightly say, but whatever it is, this guy who is super fit is undergoing, he says, hell. So we can understand then, taking the points made, that somebody who has a few things wrong with them, this most certainly will tip the balance in many cases.
Let's hope he gets better soon.
Yes.
And the same goes for our Prime Minister. Absolutely. We need it.
We do. Thank you, Greg. Really appreciate your help. And thank you for the questions. And please keep them coming. Thank you so much for listening. And we hope you enjoyed that discussion. If you wish to help support this channel, we've placed various Amazon links in the description box below, all of which are self-explanatory, and any purchases from which we shall receive a small commission to help grow the channel further. Meanwhile, please do not forget to subscribe and press the bell sign so that you're notified of any future videos as and when they are published. In addition, we have 2 complementary channels, the first Illuminati Silver and the second Trump for President 2020. And if either of these are of interest to you, then kindly go over to those likewise and subscribe. Until next time.